Lucy Knowles from Poultry World, and I'm here at the 2008 Pig and Poultry Fair in Stoneleigh. And what I want to do today is learn more about the carbon footprint. So I'm here to talk to Professor David Oglethorpe. What is the carbon footprint?
Well, the carbon footprint is effectively what mark is left on the environment by a certain set of activities. We always talk about carbon, but in fact what we're talking about is the carbon equivalence of any sort of emission. So we might have a process that emits methane or emits nitrous oxide, and all of these gases have global warming potential. They are greenhouse gases that have global warming potential. What we do is we measure those in carbon equivalents. So if, for example, a kilo of methane is equivalent to about 23 kilos of CO2. A kilo of nitrous oxide is even higher. So actually, it's not just carbon, which is the gas that we should be concerned about, carbon dioxide we should be concerned about. It's these other gases as well. But we talk about the emission and of those gases in terms of carbon, and then we say, well, how much an emission is emitted through a process, then that's the footprint that's left behind.
Why should the poultry sector be concerned about the carbon footprint?
Well, actually, the poultry sector probably has the least to worry about, because it's quite an efficient way of producing meat. Producing protein, basically, and out of all the animals that we generally consume, poultry has the lowest carbon footprint per kilo of the meat that it produces. However, it does need to understand the different types of production processes that lead to different varying sizes of carbon footprint. What's becoming well known is the fact that organic production, because it takes more energy to produce a kilo of meat, it takes longer and a great amount of feed, and the animals run around, that organic production and free-range production are less carbon efficient than the more intensive production, which doesn't seem to add up, because we associate free-range and organicness with wholesomeness. But actually it works the other way around with carbon footprints. So all industries, I think, need to be aware of these sorts of things, and that's particularly important in the poultry industry, where it's the main point of differentiation.
What is ABN's aim and initiative of the study?
Well, the aim for me was initially to get some case study evidence to feed into the DEFRA project that I'm working on, which is using mapped out supply chains to try and look at the differences and benefits and possibly unintended effects of localizing food production. But the methodology that we're using is exactly the same, basically, that you need to establish a carbon footprint. And that's where we came in with ABN. They recognised that if they could engage with us on the DEFRA project, they could give us some case studies that we could map out, and then we could take that a little bit further and try and use all that mapped out evidence to then map out the carbon footprint. So that's sort of the genesis of the project with ABN.
How are you mapping supply chains for the poultry sector?
Well, we've pretty much done all of that for the supply chains that we've selected. I mean, ultimately, what you need to do is to decide what your end product is. And for the poultry sector, we've identified 3 or 4 different end products, and we work back up the supply chain through the primary producer, through the hatcheries and the feed that goes in, and the fertilizer that goes onto the crops that are grown to supply that feed, and so on. And we've literally sat down in a room with everyone, with a player from each of the companies involved in that supply chain, and we've literally mapped out on the wall what the supply chain looks like. We've gone around and end of the day with the whole room filled with flip charts, and we've produced a picture of what the supply chain looks like. We then go back into each sort of little part of that supply chain and work out, well, okay, what energy goes into that particular process, what emissions come out of that particular process. But the real benefit of doing that is that these people necessarily wouldn't have ever sat around that table before. They may have communicated one step up and one step down the supply chain. There was no real need for them to have communicated, and suddenly you start to see that a byproduct, an output, an unnecessary output at one part of the chain could be used as an input to other parts of the chain. An example of this, we've seen that duck litter and chicken litter is particularly high in nitrogen content, and so that it has a possibility of replacing inorganic nitrogen fertilizer. Now, what that effectively does is to offset some of the carbon footprint associated with the production of the fertilizer. If you can internalise that within that supply chain and make sure that the poultry litter is going on to the farms which are growing the feed that then goes into the mills that comes back to feed the poultry, you internalise that carbon that offset of carbon, and you reduce the footprint effectively of that supply chain. So it's, the mapping has been a means to a much greater end.